The radio crackled with static and desperation. Major Hendricks stood in the command tent, watching three red dots converge on the digital map like wolves closing on wounded prey. His ground forces were pinned in the Kandahar Valley, ammunition running critical, medevac still 20 minutes out. The enemy had armor. His Marines had rocks and rapidly diminishing hope. He'd called for close air support twice. Twice he'd been told negative, weather too hostile, ceiling too low, risk assessment unfavorable. The clouds hung at 800 feet, thick as concrete, and the mountains rose like teeth on either side of the valley. No pilot in their right mind would thread that needle. Then the radio hissed again, different frequency, different voice. Vanguard Actual, this is Reaper 2-1, 5 miles out, I've got your grid. Talk to me. Hendricks blinked at the comms specialist. Who authorized that? The specialist just shook his head, eyes wide. The voice came again, calm, almost conversational despite the howl of jet engines bleeding through the transmission. Vanguard, I need confirmation on friendlies. Give me colors, infrared strobes, anything that tells me you're you. Hendricks grabbed the handset. Reaper 2-1, negative on support. Weather is below minimums. I repeat, you are not cleared. Copy your concern, Vanguard. Not asking for clearance, asking for targets. There was something in that voice. Not recklessness. Certainty. The kind that came from having done the impossible so many times it stopped feeling impossible. Hendricks looked at his second-in-command, Lieutenant Orozco, whose face had gone pale. They both knew what flying in these conditions meant. The mountains created wind shear that could flip an aircraft inverted in seconds. The clouds were thick enough to hide rock faces until impact. And if the pilot ejected, if something went wrong, there'd be nothing left but wreckage spread across 3 miles of hostile territory. Reaper 2-1, I have 3 T-72s advancing on my position, troops in the open. My people are about to get rolled, but I cannot. I will not authorize you to kill yourself trying to save us. Silence. Then quieter, almost gentle. Vanguard, I didn't ask for authorization. I asked for targets. Before Hendricks could respond, the clouds above the valley split with a sound like God tearing fabric. The A-10 Super Hornet emerged from the overcast at 400 knots, so low its exhaust disturbed the dust on the valley floor, wings leveled despite wind that would have shredded a lesser pilot's nerve. Hendricks would learn her name later, would learn why they called her Revenant, would learn that she'd been told no so many times that the word had lost all meaning. But in that moment, watching that aircraft defy physics and common sense and every regulation ever written, all he could think was, someone just rewrote the rule book, and I'm watching history happen. The first bomb fell with surgical precision. The lead erupted in a fireball that momentarily turned the gray morning orange, its turret cartwheeling through the air like a discarded toy. The shockwave rolled across the valley, and Hendricks felt it in his chest even from 300 meters away. The Marines on the ground were already moving, using the chaos as cover, their training kicking in despite exhaustion and fear. Reaper 2-1 banked hard left, so tight the wingtip nearly kissed the mountainside, vapor trails spiraling from the aircraft like silk ribbons. The second pass came from a different angle, perpendicular to the first, denying the enemy any predictable pattern. Hendricks watched through binoculars as the Hornet rolled inverted, presenting its belly to the earth for just a moment before snapping back level and releasing ordnance that turned the second tank into scrap metal. The professionalism was breathtaking. No showboating, no unnecessary risk, just pure distilled competence married to an almost supernatural awareness of three-dimensional space. Lieutenant Orozco was on the radio now, calling out enemy positions as they scattered, infantry abandoning their vehicles and running for the tree line. But Reaper 2-1 was already ahead of him, cannon fire stitching lines across the valley floor, each burst perfectly placed to corral the enemy rather than chase them. She was herding them, Hendricks realized, pushing them exactly where his Marines could engage with small arms, turning a rout into a coordinated demolition. Vanguard Actual, third target smoking, remaining hostiles are yours. I'm Winchester, heading home. You need anything else today, maybe a weather report? There was no swagger in the voice. Just dry humor, the kind soldiers use when they've just done something that should have killed them but didn't. Hendricks found himself smiling despite everything. Reaper 2-1, that was. I don't have words for what that was. Who do I thank for this? A pause, static. Wind noise over an open mic. Name's Captain Cale Winters, Vanguard, call sign Revenant, and you don't thank me. You thank the maintainers who keep this bird flying and the ordnance crew who hung these bombs. I'm just the delivery system. Then she was gone, climbing back into the clouds that should have killed her, engines fatting to a distant thunder. Hendricks stood there holding the handset, looking at the burning wreckage scattered across the valley, at his Marines already regrouping and securing the position. 27 men and women were going home tonight who shouldn't have, because one pilot decided that weather minimums were more like weather suggestions. Orozco was staring at him. "Sir, what just happened?" Hendricks shook his head slowly. "I think we just met someone who doesn't believe in impossible." What he didn't say, what he couldn't quite articulate yet, was that something about that voice bothered him. Not the confidence, plenty of pilots had that, but the weariness underneath it. The tone of someone who'd proven themselves 1,000 times and was tired of still having to prove it. He'd check the flight logs later, would make some calls, would start to piece together why a pilot that good was still a captain, why her name didn't appear in any of the after-action reports he'd read, why she seemed to exist in the margins of official recognition. The clouds closed behind the A-10 like a curtain falling, and the valley returned to its grim routine. Corpsmen moved among the Marines, checking for wounds, distributing water, speaking in low voices. The burning tanks sent black smoke into the gray sky, oily and thick. Hendricks walked the perimeter, checking positions, making sure his people understood this was a pause, not an ending. The enemy would regroup. They always did. But now his Marines had time, had hope, had seen what was possible when someone decided the rules didn't apply. Sergeant Kim found him near the northern observation post, her helmet tilted back, eyes still wide. "Sir, I got video, whole thing. Third pass, you can see the pilot thread between two ridgelines with maybe 30 feet clearance on each side." She held up her phone, hands shaking slightly. Hendricks watched the footage and his breath caught. The Hornet moved through that impossible space with the grace of a needle through silk, absolutely committed, zero hesitation. 1 degree off and the aircraft would have painted itself across granite. One gust of wind, one moment of doubt, and Captain Winters would have been a statistic. "Send that to battalion," Hendricks said quietly. "Make sure it goes up the chain. Someone needs to see this." Kim nodded, already tapping at her screen. Hendricks knew what would happen. The brass would watch it, shake their heads, probably generate paperwork about unauthorized missions and weather violations. They'd miss the point entirely. They'd see risk instead of result, violation instead of valor. It was always the same story. The ones who pushed boundaries, who understood that sometimes perfect by-the-book execution wasn't enough, they were the ones who got hammered by regulation. Meanwhile, the cautious ones, the ones who said no and let people die because the manual said conditions weren't optimal, they got promoted. Orozco appeared at his elbow. "Medevac's inbound, sir. 5 minutes. Good, get our casualties prepped." There were only 3, remarkably. 1 broken leg from a rockfall during the initial contact, 2 shrapnel wounds from near misses before Reaper 2-1 arrived. It should have been 20 casualties, should have been body bags. The helicopter appeared through the overcast, and Hendricks found himself looking at the same clouds that had nearly killed Captain Winters. They seemed thinner now, less threatening, as if her passage had somehow altered their nature. Ridiculous thought, but he held it anyway. By nightfall, the valley was secured. The enemy had withdrawn completely, their armor destroyed, their infantry scattered. Hendricks sat in the command tent, writing his after-action report, choosing his words carefully. He'd been in the Corps long enough to know how to navigate the bureaucracy. You emphasized the positive, minimized the irregular, and made sure the right people got credit. He wrote about Captain Winters in glowing terms, mentioned her call sign, her unit, her actions, made it clear that without her intervention, the situation would have deteriorated catastrophically. He didn't mention that she'd ignored protocol, didn't mention the weather, didn't mention that by every regulation in the book, she should have turned around. Sometimes you had to protect people from their own excellence. The report went up the chain, through battalion, through regiment, through the bureaucratic machinery that turned battlefield action into official record. Hendricks imagined it sitting on various desks, being read by various officers who'd never been shot at, never had to watch their people bleed, never had to make the choice between following orders and doing what was right. 3 days later, he got a call from a colonel at division. The voice was clipped, professional, annoyed. "Major Hendricks, I'm looking at your AAR from the Kandahar Valley operation. You mentioned a Captain Winters providing close air support in weather conditions that were explicitly below minimums. Can you confirm those details?" Hendricks kept his voice neutral. "Yes, sir. Captain Winters arrived on station when my position was being overrun. Her intervention was decisive. My casualties would have been significantly higher without her." Silence on the other end. "Then, Major, do you understand that Captain Winters violated standing orders, that she put herself and a multi-million-dollar aircraft at risk, that her actions, regardless of outcome, represent a serious breach of protocol?" Hendricks felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Sir, with respect, her actions saved the lives of 27 Marines. I'm not sure protocol is the primary concern here." "That's not your decision to make, Major. The rules exist for good reasons. We can't have pilots freelancing, making their own assessments of risk. It sets a dangerous precedent." Hendricks closed his eyes. There it was, the institutional reflex to punish success that looked too much like insubordination. "Sir, I respectfully request that you take into account the outcome. Captain Winters demonstrated exceptional skill and judgment. I've read your report, Major. I'll take it under advisement, that's all." The line went dead. Hendricks sat there, phone in hand, feeling the familiar weight of military politics settling on his shoulders. He'd tried. He'd written the best report he could, emphasized the positive, made the case for recognition. But he knew how this would go. Captain Winters would get called into some office, would stand at attention while someone who'd never faced enemy fire lectured her about regulations and chain of command. She'd take it because she had to, because that was how the system worked. And next time when someone else needed help and the weather was bad and the risk was high, maybe she'd hesitate. Maybe she'd follow the rules and let people die. The thought made him sick. He pulled up his email, started drafting a message to his battalion commander, then deleted it. Started another to the Marine Corps Times, deleted that too. There was no good move here. Anything he did publicly would just make it worse for Winters, would paint a target on her back. So he did the only thing he could. He reached out to some friends, other officers who'd been around, who understood how things really worked. Started making quiet inquiries about Captain Winters, about her record, about why someone that good was still a captain. The answers came back in fragments, whispered conversations in hallways, careful emails that said much by saying little. Captain Cale Winters had been in the Navy for 12 years, had flown combat missions in 3 different theaters, had a record that should have made her a commander by now, possibly even further along. But there was a pattern. Every time she came up for promotion, something went wrong. A fitness report that was technically positive but used coded language that signaled concern. An incident report about unauthorized action, always with the caveat that the action had been successful but had violated procedure. A note in her file about difficulty working within established parameters. Hendricks recognized the pattern. He'd seen it before, usually applied to officers who were too good, too independent, too willing to question authority when the situation demanded it. The military needed people who could think for themselves, but only up to a point. Too much initiative, too much willingness to break rules for the right reasons, and you became a liability. You became someone the brass couldn't control, couldn't predict, couldn't trust to stay in your lane. Captain Winters had been in that lane for years, apparently. Flying her missions, saving lives, racking up commendations that somehow never translated into advancement. A friend at BUPRS, the Navy's Personnel Command, sent him a note. "Your pilot friend has a fan club among the people who have worked with her. Ask around the squadrons and you'll hear stories. But upstairs, they see a problem that keeps not taking the hint." Hendricks felt anger building, the slow burn that came from watching bureaucracy crush excellence. He'd been in long enough to be cynical about it, but cynicism didn't make it easier. 27 Marines were alive because Captain Winters had decided to ignore the weather report. That should mean something. That should count. He made one more call, this time to a reporter he knew at the Marine Corps Gazette, a woman who'd done good work on several stories about innovative tactics. "I've got something for you," he said when she answered, "but it needs to be handled carefully. Can't blow back on the subject." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm listening." He told her the story. The valley, the weather, the three tanks, the voice on the radio. The aftermath, the colonel's call, the pattern of a career that should have gone further. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "This is good," she finally said. "But you're right, it's delicate. If I write this and it draws attention, it could make things worse for her. The brass doesn't like being embarrassed." "I know, but someone needs to tell this story. Someone needs to push back against the idea that following regulations matters more than mission accomplishment. Give me a few days. Let me think about the angle. And Major, thank you for bringing this to me. This is the kind of story that matters." Hendricks hung up, not sure if he'd helped or just made things worse. But at least he'd tried. At least he'd done something other than just accept that this was how things worked. The story ran 3 weeks later. The headline read, "The Pilot They Won't Promote: How Bureaucracy Punishes Excellence." It was carefully written, sourced from multiple people who'd worked with Captain Winters, balanced enough that it couldn't be dismissed as hit piece. It detailed her record, her missions, the pattern of promotions that never came. It mentioned the Kandahar Valley operation, though Hendricks wasn't quoted directly. The response was immediate and divided. Among the rank and file, among the people who actually flew missions and faced enemy fire, the reaction was supportive. Online forums filled with stories about Captain Winters, other times she'd done the impossible, other missions where she'd been the difference between success and catastrophe. Her call sign, Revenant, took on mythic status. The word meant someone who returned from death, and the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. She kept coming back, kept flying, kept proving herself despite every institutional obstacle. But among the brass, the reaction was predictably hostile. A PAO statement was issued, carefully worded, emphasizing the importance of following procedures and suggesting that the article had oversimplified complex issues of command and control. Several senior officers went on record, not mentioning Winters by name but making it clear they believed pilots who couldn't follow orders were dangerous regardless of their skill level. Hendricks watched it all unfold from his outpost in Afghanistan, refreshing news sites during the rare moments he had internet access. He'd known this would be messy, had known there'd be pushback, but he'd hoped, perhaps naively, that the sheer weight of evidence would matter. That someone would look at Captain Winters' record and realize they were wasting an asset. Instead, what happened was predictable. Captain Winters was quietly reassigned, moved from her combat squadron to a training role stateside. The official explanation was that her experience made her valuable as an instructor. The unofficial word was that she'd been benched, put somewhere she couldn't embarrass anyone or make the brass look bad by continuing to be exceptional in ways that violated norms. Hendricks felt responsible. He'd pushed the story and now she was paying the price. He drafted an email to her trying to apologize, trying to explain that he'd thought he was helping. He never sent it. What could he say? "Sorry, I tried to get you recognized and instead got you sidelined." The system had closed ranks and protected itself, the way it always did, but something unexpected happened. The story didn't die. Other journalists picked it up. Military blogs ran pieces. Veterans groups started using Captain Winters as an example of what was wrong with promotion systems that valued conformity over competence. Her name became shorthand for a larger conversation about how the military treated people who didn't fit neatly into institutional molds. And then, 6 months after the Kandahar Valley operation, Hendricks got an email. The address was unfamiliar, the message brief. "Major Hendricks, heard you've been making noise on my behalf. Appreciate the thought, even if the execution got messy. Don't beat yourself up. This fight's been going on longer than you've been involved. KW." He stared at the email for a long time, reading between the lines. She wasn't angry, wasn't blaming him, just acknowledging reality the same way she'd acknowledged the weather that day over Kandahar, something to be noted and navigated, not something to rage against. Hendricks typed a response, deleted it, typed another. Finally settled on, "Captain, if I had 20 more pilots like you, we'd win every fight. Sorry, the institution doesn't see that. Fair wins." Her reply came an hour later. "The institution sees it fine. That's the problem. They want pilots who fly missions. I want to win wars, not always compatible goals." That response told him more than all the official records had. Captain Winters understood exactly what she was and what the military needed her to be, and she'd chosen her path knowing it would cost her. There was something admirable in that, something tragic. Months passed. Hendricks rotated home, took command of a training battalion at Quantico, settled into the rhythms of peacetime service. He'd hear about Captain Winters occasionally, through the informal networks that connected people who'd served together. She was at Miramar now, teaching young pilots how to fly the Hornet. By all accounts, she was good at it, patient and thorough and willing to share the hard-won knowledge that came from a decade of combat flying. But everyone who mentioned her said the same thing. She seemed diminished somehow, like a wild thing in a cage. Teaching was important work, crucial even, but it wasn't the same as being out there on the edge making split-second decisions that meant life or death. One evening, Hendricks got a call from Lieutenant Orozco, who'd stayed in theater and was now running operations for a MEU in the Persian Gulf. "Sir, you remember that pilot, Revenant, Captain Winters?" Hendricks felt his pulse quicken. "Of course, what about her?" "There's a petition circulating. Bunch of Marines and Navy personnel who have worked with her, pushing for her to get Navy Cross recognition for that Kandahar mission. Thought you'd want to know, maybe add your name to it." The Navy Cross, third highest decoration for valor, behind only the Medal of Honor and the Navy's variant of the Distinguished Service Cross. It was a serious recognition, one that carried weight even among the brass who'd been trying to keep Captain Winters in check. "Send me the details," Hendricks said. "I'll sign it, and I'll push it with everyone I know." The petition gathered signatures quickly, hundreds of them, from people who'd been saved by Captain Winters or had flown with her or had simply heard the stories and recognized excellence when they saw it. It included detailed accounts of missions, testimonials from ground commanders, even weather data from that day in Kandahar proving just how suicidal the flying conditions had been. It went up the chain, through the same bureaucratic machinery that had tried to suppress Captain Winters' career. And for once, the machinery couldn't ignore it. There were too many signatures, too much documentation, too much attention. Denying the recognition would raise more questions than approving it. The award ceremony was scheduled for June, at Naval Air Station Lemoore in California's Central Valley. Hendricks pulled strings to get leave, drove 8 hours from Quantico to be there. The base was crisp and ordered, rows of A-10s lined up on the tarmac like sleeping raptors, their gray paint schemes designed for invisibility against clouded skies. He found the ceremony venue, a hangar that had been cleared and decorated with flags and unit colors. Already a crowd was gathering, officers in dress uniforms, enlisted personnel who'd worked with Captain Winters, civilians who looked like family. Hendricks spotted Orozco near the front, now wearing captain's bars himself. They shook hands, and Orozco gestured toward the side of the hangar where a woman in navy dress white stood speaking quietly with an older couple. "That's her," Orozco said unnecessarily. Hendricks studied Captain Winters carefully. She was shorter than he'd imagined, maybe 5'6", with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Her uniform was immaculate, ribbons precise, shoes gleaming. But it was her posture that struck him, shoulders back, spine straight, yet somehow still giving the impression of someone ready to move instantly in any direction. A fighter's stance, even standing still. Her face was carefully neutral, the expression of someone who'd been through too many official functions and had learned to mask whatever she actually felt. Only her eyes moved, tracking the room, noting exits and people and patterns. Pilot's eyes, always gathering data, always 3 steps ahead. The ceremony began with the usual military formality. An Admiral Hendricks didn't recognize gave a speech about valor and service, careful not to mention the controversy that surrounded Captain Winter's career. Several other awards were presented first, routine commendations for administrative excellence and training achievements. Then Captain Winters was called forward. She walked to the center of the hangar with measured steps, came to attention before the admiral. Her face remained impassive as the citation was read aloud, detailing the Kandahar Valley operation in dry official language that somehow failed to capture the insanity of what she'd done. For extraordinary heroism while serving as pilot of an A-10 Super Hornet in direct support of ground forces engaged with hostile forces in the Kandahar province of Afghanistan. Captain Winters, with complete disregard for her own safety, flew her aircraft through weather conditions deemed unsuitable for flight operations to provide close air support to Marines under heavy enemy fire. Her exceptional skill and unwavering dedication to mission accomplishment resulted in the destruction of 3 enemy tanks and enabled friendly forces to repel a superior enemy force. Captain Winter's courageous actions and selfless devotion to duty reflected great credit upon herself and were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. The Admiral pinned the Navy Cross to her uniform, and the room erupted in applause. Captain Winters saluted, about-faced, and returned to her position, her expression unchanged. Hendricks watched carefully, looking for some sign of emotion, pride, relief, vindication, but saw nothing. After the ceremony, there was a reception in an adjacent building, the usual awkward mingling of ranks over lukewarm coffee and government shoe cookies. Hendricks worked his way through the crowd, accepting congratulations from people who'd read about his role in the operation, shaking hands with Marines who'd been in the valley that day. Finally, he found Captain Winters standing near a window, alone, staring out at the flight line. He approached carefully, like you might approach a skittish animal. "Captain Winters." "Major Hendricks, we spoke briefly over the radio in Kandahar." She turned, and for the first time he saw something flicker in her eyes, recognition, assessment, then a slight smile that didn't quite reach her full expression. "Major, good to put a face to the voice. You wrote a hell of an after-action report, apparently. Started this whole mess." Her tone was neutral, impossible to read as criticism or gratitude. Hendricks decided to go with honesty. "You saved 27 of my Marines." "I figured the least I could do was make sure someone noticed." She nodded slowly, looking back out the window. 27. I knew it was significant, but I didn't know the exact number. That's good. That matters." They stood in silence for a moment, watching an FA-18 taxi past the window, its pilot running through pre-flight checks. "Can I ask you something?" Hendricks said. "That day, coming through the clouds like that, were you scared?" Captain Winters considered the question, her eyes tracking the aircraft. "Fear's not really the right word. I was aware of the risk, knew the margins, but I'd flown in worse, just not officially, and I knew what would happen if I didn't try. Math was pretty simple. The colonel who called me, the one investigating your actions, he said you violated standing orders, that you put yourself and the aircraft at risk unnecessarily." Now she did smile, and there was an edge to it, something sharp and knowing. "That colonel flew a desk in the Gulf War and thinks reading weather reports makes him an expert on flight operations. He's never had to decide whether to follow orders or save lives. Easy to judge when you're not the one making the call. Does it bother you? The pushback, the career impact?" She turned to face him fully, and he saw something in her expression he hadn't expected, not anger or resentment, but a kind of weary determination. "Major, I became a pilot because I wanted to be excellent at something that mattered. I wanted to save lives and win fights and be part of something bigger than myself. The Navy gave me that opportunity, but they also gave me a uniform and a rank and a set of expectations about how I was supposed to operate. And somewhere along the way, I had to choose between being the pilot they wanted and being the pilot people needed. I made my choice. This," she gestured at the Navy Cross on her chest, "is nice, but it doesn't change anything. Next time the weather's bad and someone's dying, I'll make the same call, and they'll write me up for it again." Hendricks felt something shift in his understanding. He'd thought of Captain Winters as someone fighting against the system, struggling for recognition and advancement. But that wasn't it at all. She'd already won her fight, had already decided what mattered. The institution's approval or disapproval was irrelevant to her sense of purpose. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now, I teach for a while, share what I know with the next generation, hopefully help them be better than I was. Eventually, maybe I get back to a combat squadron. Maybe I don't. Either way, I'll fly. That's all that matters." She said it with such simple certainty that Hendricks felt his own complicated feelings about military career advancement seemed small and petty. He'd spent years navigating the politics, trying to balance excellence with institutional expectations, worrying about fitness reports and promotion boards. Captain Winters had opted out of that entire game. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you're the best pilot I've ever seen. I think the Navy's a better institution because you're in it, even if they don't always recognize that. And I think those 27 Marines would agree with me." She met his eyes then, really looked at him, and for a moment the careful mask dropped. He saw the weight she carried, the accumulated exhaustion of proving herself over and over, the loneliness of being exceptional in ways that made people uncomfortable. But he also saw pride. Not arrogance, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who knew their worth regardless of what any promotion board said. "Thank you, Major. That actually means something." They shook hands, and Hendricks felt the strength in her grip, the calluses that came from thousands of hours controlling a fighter jet. Then she was gone, moving back into the crowd, accepting congratulations with the same neutral professionalism she'd shown throughout the ceremony. Hendricks watched her go, feeling like he'd just witnessed something important, though he couldn't quite articulate what. He stayed for another hour, talking to other attendees, hearing more stories about Captain Winters. The pattern was consistent. She'd been the difference maker in multiple operations, had pulled off impossible missions, had saved lives when everyone else said it couldn't be done. And in every case, she'd paid some price for it, taken heat for violating procedure or exceeding authority. One Marine captain told him about a time in Helmand Province when Captain Winters had kept a Harrier in the air for 2 extra hours, well beyond fuel reserves, because her relief had been delayed and Marines on the ground were still in contact. She'd landed with fumes in the tank, barely enough to taxi to parking. The ground commander had written her up for it. Another pilot mentioned a training incident where Captain Winters had prevented a mid-air collision by violating flight procedures, taking her aircraft into another squadron's airspace without authorization, because she'd seen something the other pilot had missed. She'd saved 2 aircraft and 4 lives. She'd gotten an administrative reprimand. The stories accumulated like sediment, building a picture of someone caught between 2 competing values: institutional order and mission success. The military needed both, couldn't function without structure and hierarchy and rules. But it also needed people who understood that rules were tools, not ends in themselves, and that sometimes the right call was the unauthorized one. Captain Winters lived in that tension, and it had defined her career. Hendricks drove back to Quantico that evening, watching the sun set over the California mountains, thinking about excellence and institutions and the price of being different. He'd spent his career trying to balance those competing demands, trying to be good enough to matter but not so good that he made people uncomfortable. Captain Winters had rejected that compromise entirely. She'd chosen to be as good as she could possibly be and let the chips fall where they may. There was something both inspiring and heartbreaking about that choice. The months after the ceremony brought unexpected developments. The article in the Marine Corps Gazette, combined with the Navy Cross Award and the continued circulation of video from the Kandahar operation, created a groundswell of attention that the Navy couldn't ignore. Captain Winters became something of a folk hero among junior officers and enlisted personnel, someone who represented the gap between official military culture and the warrior ethos that actually won battles. Social media accounts shared the video of her threading the valley, superimposed with dramatic music and commentary. Military meme pages created content celebrating her defiance of authority. Even civilian aviation enthusiasts picked up the story, marveling at the technical skill required to fly in those conditions. The Navy's public affairs apparatus tried to manage the narrative issuing statements about professionalism and proper procedure, but they were fighting a losing battle. Captain Winters had become a symbol, and symbols don't obey talking points. What surprised everyone, including Hendricks, was that Captain Winters herself seemed completely unaffected by the attention. She continued teaching at Miramar, showing up for simulator sessions and classroom instruction, treating young pilots with the same thorough professionalism she brought to combat flying. Students who expected to find some larger-than-life figure, instead, encountered a woman who cared intensely about the technical details of weapons employment and energy management and checklist discipline. She didn't talk about Kandahar unless specifically asked, and even then she framed it in terms of decision-making process rather than heroics. The situation required a response, she told one class of student pilots who'd pressed her for details. I assessed the risk, determined it was acceptable given the stakes, and executed. You'll face similar decisions. The key is to understand your aircraft's capabilities, trust your training, and not let fear make the choice for you. But also, and this is important, don't confuse confidence with invincibility. Respect the environment. Respect the machine. The moment you think you're too good to get killed, you're already dead. It was classic Captain Winters, acknowledging what she'd done while refusing to mythologize it, extracting the lesson without the ego. Hendricks heard about this through the network, from a lieutenant who'd been in that class and had written to thank him for pushing the Navy Cross nomination. Sir, she's different from any instructor I've had. Most of them teach you how to pass check rides and not make mistakes. Captain Winters teaches you how to win. She's constantly talking about the mission, about the people on the ground counting on you, about how every decision you make echoes beyond the cockpit. It's intense, but it's what we need. That assessment felt right to Hendricks. Captain Winters had always been about the mission, about the outcome, about the people who lived or died based on what happened in the next few seconds. The uniform and the rank were just tools to enable that. A year after Kandahar, she was promoted to commander. The promotion was quiet, no fanfare, processed through routine channels as if nothing unusual had happened. Hendricks suspected there had been intense debate about it, probably with some officers arguing she didn't deserve advancement given her history of violations, others pointing out that blocking her promotion after a Navy Cross would be indefensible. In the end, bureaucracy had found a compromise: promote her, but keep her in the training pipeline, away from operational squadrons where she might cause more trouble. Commander Winters took the promotion the same way she'd taken everything else, with professional acknowledgement and no visible emotion. She continued teaching, continued flying training sorties, continued being herself, which meant being exceptional in ways that made people uncomfortable. Hendricks was promoted to lieutenant colonel around the same time, given command of a battalion deploying to the Pacific. His Marines trained at Miramar for a month, working with Navy aviation units on close air support procedures. He made a point of attending several training sessions that Commander Winters led, watching her work with young pilots and ground controllers. She'd refined her teaching since he'd last seen her, developed a method that combined technical rigor with emotional intelligence. She didn't just teach procedures, she taught decision-making under pressure, helped students understand the psychological dynamics of fear and confidence and responsibility. One evening, after a particularly complex training scenario, he found her in a briefing room alone reviewing footage of the day's flights. "Commander, you've built something impressive here. These pilots are lucky to have you." She looked up, smiled slightly. "Colonel Hendricks, heard you made Lieutenant Colonel. Congratulations." "How's the battalion?" "Good. Solid Marines, good NCOs. We're heading to Okinawa in 6 weeks. Figured we should get smart on air-ground integration before we deploy." "Smart? Most units don't take the